Hello everyone, my name is MrNJersey and welcome to my channel. In this video we are going to be showing you a full tutorial on how to build a modular engine here in Stormworks. Now modular engines was just released onto the public branch and a lot of people have having a little bit of a struggle actually creating them and controlling them here. So this will be a full tutorial showing you how to build the engine, also how to get it up and running, and then what you can actually do with it. So you'll see here we've got a couple different examples, from the large marine engines to small little outboards to a little bit of a smaller marine engine to a couple different car designs that we have here. Now the joy about modular engines here in Stormworks is that you can build them depending on what you need. So if we need something small, we can build it small. If we need something large, we can build it large. So let's get started with actually building our first engine here in Stormworks. I've just started by laying a simple little bit of foundation down that we're going to be building our engine on top of. The first thing we always want to do when we're building with modular engines, the first piece is you're going to need a crankshaft. Now you can use different sizes here in Stormworks. We could use the 1x1, we could use the 3x1, we could use the 3x3 or the 5x5. You have 4 different options to choose from. For example, let's go with a 1x1. So we're going to place a few of these down. Now we can add as many as we want, or we can just have 2 or 3 or 1. It's once again up to you because it's modular. You can make it as big or as small as you want. The next thing you're going to have to add is you're going to need cylinders. Now we have 3 different choices, either 1x1, the 3x3 or the 5x5. Now depending on what type of crankshaft you're using, you're going to have to use the same type of cylinder. So for example, we've chosen the 1x1, we're going to need to use the 1x1 cylinder. If we had chosen the 3x3 crankshaft, we would need to use the 3x3 cylinder. So we're going to go and get some cylinders down. Now you can place them down on any of the exposed pieces on the crankshaft. So for example, I've just gone and placed them at the top there. We could even go and add some on the side here so we can continue filling out this whole engine with different pieces of actual cylinders. Now one thing to note here is that if you have your cylinders in a row, like I have just over here, they do actually share their air, their fuel, their exhaust, and their cooling. However, as soon as you've gone and separated them like I have right here, there is no link between them, which means that each row will need its own fuel, air, cooling, and so on. Now you can get around this by using a manifold piece. Now if we go and get a manifold piece just over here, we have 3 to choose from, either the corner piece, the straight piece, or also the manifold T piece. Now, if for example, we wanted to share the air, the fuel, the cooling, and the exhaust between all 3 of these cylinder rows, all we would have to do is connect them to each other. So you can see here, I've just connected that bank of cylinders to the top one, and I can go and connect this bank over to the top bank also. So now we only need 1 air, 1 fuel, 1 exhaust, and 1 cooling for all 3 of those banks of cylinders. Okay, so just be aware of that. If you have them in a row like I have just over here, you do not need to use the manifold pieces to connect them up to each other. Now we've got that done, the next thing we need to do is of course go and convert our power from our engine into something. Now the only way you can do this is to use a clutch. Now once again, we have 3 different types of clutches that we can use for the modular engines. We have the 1x1, the 3x3, and the 5x5. These of course represent the different types of engines you're building. We're building a 1x1, so we're going to be using a 1x1 clutch. And we can simply go and place it at the end of our engine, just over here. Now we can continue building out the engine by adding gearboxes, but I'm not going to focus on the gearboxes in this tutorial. This is going to be focused mainly on just building the engine and actually getting it up and running for the first time. Now we got that, the next key part that we could add is going to be the drive belt. Now you don't have to have a drive belt, and you also have 3 different options. Once again, one for the 1x1, the one for the 3x3, and the one for the 5x5. Okay, we're building a 1x1 engine, so we're choosing the 1x1 drive belt. As I said earlier, you don't have to add this onto your engine. The only purpose of adding this on is if you want to use any of the belt driven accessories. For example, the belt starter, the belt alternator. If you are planning on using one of those 3 pieces, then you will need one of these drive belts at the front of your engine. Of course, as I said, if we don't use that, if we're going to use our own pumps or our own starters, for example, an electrical engine, then we don't have to use it. For our example, we're going to just be building it with this, and we're going to be using a regular starter that connects over to this drive belt. So now that we've got that done, we can start adding our accessories. So for example, the key thing for this engine, if I'm not using an electrical engine, as I said earlier, I could have used an electrical engine. I'm not. I'm going to be using a starter to start my engine up. So we're going to need the starter piece itself. Now I can place this down, just make sure it is lined up. As you can see there, it is now gone and being lined up with the actual drive belt there. So as the starter turns, it's going to start turning the engine, okay? And we could also add an alternator on here that will obviously produce electricity if we wanted it to. So once the engine's rotating, it will actually start rotating the alternator, which will produce electricity. We could also add on a pump here. It does exactly the same thing. Once the engine starts running and starts rotating, it will start rotating this pump and start actually moving fluid through the pump. We'll come back to the pump later on and we'll talk about it. So now that we actually have our actual drive belt, we have our actual cylinders, we have our crankshaft, we have our clutch, and we have our starter. We now need to start working on the 4 fundamental elements that all engines need. That is the air, the fuel, the exhaust, and also going to be the cooling. Okay, so all 4 of those things have to be set up in this engine. Let's start with more of the easier thing, which is going to be the actual cooling. So we're going to go and search for cooling, and you can see we have a cooling manifold. Now we can place this anywhere on our engine that we want, as long as it matches one of the cylinder heads. So you can see there, it fits onto the cylinder piece. So we're going to go and put one just over here, okay? Once we've got that in, we obviously need a way to go and cool it. Now, we could use a radiator for this example. We could use a heat exchanger for this example. There's a lot of different ways that you can cool your engines. I will be doing a follow-up video on this, on different ways that you can cool your engines, and I'll be using all the different types. But for our example now, we're just going to use a simple fluid heat radiator. Okay, it has an in and an out port. It's that simple to use. Okay, so we're going to go and place it down just over here. So once we have that placed down, we of course need to go and get this all connected up. But if we were to go and get everything connected up, there's actually nothing pushing the fluid around here. So we need to add some type of pump. Now, once again, we have several different types of pumps in Stormworks. We have an electrical pump, which just takes a simple on off. We have the impeller large pump, impeller small pump, which goes and actually takes a torque or a power input. We also have a large fluid pump, so that's an electrical one also. And we also have the pump that goes onto your drive belt here at the front. Now for our example, we're going to use this one because we have the space, and why not? So we can go and place it there. Once again, make sure it lines up with your actual crankshaft there. Now you'll notice on the pump, it has an in and it also has an out on the pump. Now we don't really need to worry about that too much because the actual coolant manifold piece doesn't have an in out, and this radiator doesn't have an in out. So we don't need to worry about what direction we put the pipes in. So we're going to start and get this all connected up. So you can see here I'm going from the pump into our manifold. From our manifold, we're going to go straight into our radiator. And then from our radiator, we're going to go to the actual inlet of the pump, which is just down over here. Now, another key thing that you should take note of is that once we've built this loop, there is no fluid in it. This loop does not spawn with any fluid. So you need to make sure that you add some way of getting some fluid in there. Easiest way to do that is to get a fluid tank. Now, when you get a fluid tank, you can simply just go and place it down. Make sure you match the pipe to the actual inlet port, which is just over there, and we're going to go and place it down. Now, when a fluid tank spawns, it spawns with diesel inside it. I've seen a lot of people complaining about their cooling not working because they forgot to change this over. Now, we have 2 different types of water in Stormworks. We have fresh water and we also have seawater. You can choose either one of these examples. Personally, you should use fresh water for cooling your engines. The main reason for this is that fresh water will not actually start scaling your engine up and start damaging it. If you were to switch this over to seawater, the salt in the seawater will slowly start to scale your engine up and start to degrade its performance and start damaging it in the long term. Obviously, in a few minutes, it won't do anything, but over the long term, it will. Now, this is great. We can choose fresh water. That's really quite nice and easy. We could go into a little bit more detail of start using some heat exchangers where we could use seawater plus fresh water to cool our engine. But for our example, we're just going to stick with a small little tank here of fresh water. The last part we need to do is we need to, of course, go and get the last part connected here. So we're just going to go and get that all connected up. Okay, so that's a very basic setup of cooling. We have the pump, we have the manifold cooling, we have the radiator, and we have the tank of water. Tank of water is essential to get fluid in this loop. So that takes care of the cooling. The next thing is going to be the exhaust. Now, once again, as I said earlier, you don't have to go and place exhaust on every single one of these cylinders heads, like I'm showing here. You only have to place your exhaust on one of them, okay? Because they are connected in a row, there's a bank of cylinders, you only need one input or output for all these things that we're doing right now. So we're gonna put a corner piece pipe, we also have a straight piece pipe for the exhaust, and once we've taken it out of the engine, it's now converted to an actual pipe piece. So we could now go and extend it using the regular pipes in Stormworks. I don't need to extend it, so I'm just going to go and put an exhaust on the end of it. Now you don't have to use an exhaust, you can use any of the fluid ports. Now what do you mean by that? Well, if you scroll down to where we have all the fluid options in your inventory, you'll notice that there is the fluid slot port that we could use for exhaust. We could use the fluid port for exhaust, or we could actually just use the proper exhaust piece that we have over here. As I said, a lot of different options. We're going to stick with the regular exhaust piece just over there because it looks like a proper exhaust. Okay, so that takes care of the cooling and that takes care of the exhaust. The last two things that we need for this engine is going to be the fuel, and we're also going to need the air. So we can go and search for the air, and you can see we have a modular engine air manifold. This can simply go and get placed on one of the cylinder pieces. As I said earlier, we don't need to place several of these down because they share all their components together because they're in a row here. So we're going to go and place the air down. While we're there, we can also go and get the intake fuel manifold. So we can simply once again go and place that down. Now, as a general rule of thumb, you need one part of air of this air we have currently at the moment versus half a part of fuel. Okay, on this example, once again, this example, it changes depending on what type of air intake we use. We could have put a pump onto this air intake, which once again would increase the amount of air, which means we would need more fuel. Now, as I said, if we stick with a regular setup where we're going to take a single air in, which is just there, so a simple air filter, we could use a fluid port if we wanted to instead. That's a single piece going in there. Okay, and we have a single fuel entry. So for example, this is going to go into a single tank. Okay, then that means that we need 2 parts of air versus 1 part of fuel as a general rough calculation. Again, we'll talk about setting up the air fuel ratio in a few minutes. Okay, but just be aware of that. Of course, if you double up on your fuel, let's say we add a fuel here and a fuel here, that means that in theory, we are probably going to have too much fuel. Same goes if we go and add more air on here. We have 2 or 3 airs and only 1 fuel. That means that we're going to have too much air. A general rule of thumb for me when I've been building these engines is for every air intake I put on my engine, I also put a fuel intake. Okay, so 1 air versus 1 fuel. That way I get my ratios right. But as I said, it's up to you on how you want to build your engine. That's the whole point of it being modular here in Stormworks. So now that I've got my air with an air filter, I've got my fuel intake, and I'm going to go and put a simple tank on top of it. So you can see there it's going from the actual fuel intake into the tank, or from the tank into the cylinder. Make sure that it's on diesel. These engines run on diesel. They don't run on water. They don't run on jet fuel. So make sure it's on diesel. Okay, it does start diesel by its default. So just be aware of that. Okay, so now that we've got everything here, that is in theory all we need. Okay, to get our first engine actually up and running here in Stormworks. Now, as I said, we could add more things like gearboxes, clutches, propellers, wheels. We could add a whole bunch of things on here. I'm going to leave that up to you because you might be doing a car, you might be doing a boat, you might be doing a helicopter. You can go and add whatever you want to on here, and you can add the gearboxes that you want on here. Okay, so let's actually get this engine up and running for the first time. Okay, so the first thing we're going to need is some way to actually turn it on and off. Well, to do that, we're going to need the starter motor. But to get the starter motor working, we're going to need some electricity. So we're going to go and put a battery down here. That's going to be our source of electricity to actually get the starter motor running on this engine. Once we've got that on, we're going to go and get a little button to push so that we can start the engine. Okay, so we're just going to go and get a simple push button that will allow us to push it to start the starter motor. Okay, so simple little one there. Along with that, we also need to control the air and we need to control the fuel. So there's two different things that we can go from. We're going to use two throttle levers. Okay, it's the easiest way. I've got a full mic controller that does this for you. However, this is what we're going to go with for our example right now. Okay, so you can see we have two throttle levers, one to control the air and one to control the fuel of the engine. Moving on from that, well, we can start to get everything connected now. So we're going to go to our logic and we're going to start connecting all of this up. You'll notice that there has got nodes on the engine parts and there's nodes on the control part. So let's start connecting everything. We're going to take our push button, which is for the starter, and we're going to connect it over to our starter just over here. Okay, so that's going to allow us to start everything. Now, we actually have a little pump that is connected here for our cooling. Now, the pump does have a little clutch on it. So if you give it 0, it means it's not actually allowing any power from the engine into the pump, so it's not going to move anything around. Okay, so just be aware of that. What I usually would recommend is to go and get a constant number. So you go and put a 1 on that clutch all the time, which means it's always moving. Okay, so we're going to put on the constant number, we're going to click on 1, and we're going to go and connect that over to our actual clutch of our little pump here. Once we've got that, we can also start controlling our air and our fuel. So you'll notice here we have a throttle lever and we have another throttle lever. Now we can, in theory, go and connect them up, and I'm going to do it for my example. So we're going to connect up this one over here, we're going to connect this one up over here, and we can even go into it and say, hey, this one is the air and this one is the fuel. Now, I'll probably recommend, if you are doing it exactly like this, lower the sensitivity down to about 20 or 20% plus minus, so that you can do some fine tuning here. Okay, we're just going to do this for now, and I'll show you an easier way to do the throttle in a few minutes to control the AFR values. Okay, and we'll talk about AFR also in a few minutes. Once we've got that connected, in theory, there's nothing else we need to do. We, of course, can control our clutch. How much power are we letting through into our wheel or the propeller? Once again, you can use a throttle lever, you could use a constant number, you could use whatever you want. Just be aware that if you have got a 1 value, which means power is going through the clutch, then just remember that when you add wheels or propellers or generators at the other end of this, those do take load. So it might be harder for your engine to start up when you've got the power going through the clutch. So just be aware of that. Okay, now that we have that all done, the last thing we need to do is connect the electricity. So we're going to go from our battery to our actual starter, and we're going to get it all connected to our controls that we have over here. Once we've got that, we can then go and spawn this in. Now, as I said earlier, when it comes to getting the fuel and the air ratio correct, usually if you follow a simple setup like this where you have 1 air and 1 fuel, you probably need double the amount of air as you do fuel in this example. So for example, if we come here to the air, and let's say the air is, let's do 0.3, which is 30 for me, we're going to do 0.15 for the fuel, okay? So we now need to get this engine started. To do so, we're just going to hold the push button, and the engine is now up and running. Now it's running really high because we have our throttle quite high here. If we wanted to get this a little bit lower, we could of course go and drop this down to, let's say, let's do 0.10 and then 0.5 on the fuel. Okay, so now you can see the engine's running around 4 RPS. Okay, so very low on our throttles. Of course, if we want more throttle, we increase the air, increase the fuel, and it will run better. Now, if we have a look at the actual stats of this engine, you can see the air-fuel ratio is currently 14:2. Okay, that means it's got 14.2 parts of air versus 1 part of fuel in this engine. Efficiency 97.3%, temperature 34. Now, if you want to double check that all of this is working and it's all up and running, just click on page up on your keyboard, and you can now hover over things to see, oh yeah, my pump actually is working, this is working, oh look, the temperature on this is working. It's all really cool. Okay, you can also see the coolant scaling if you've got seawater in there, okay, which is another cool thing. Okay, so now it's time to make this a little bit easier. Now we've already learned that if we were to give a throttle of 1 for the air, we can give half the amount of fuel to make this engine run at the ideal AFR, the fuel air ratio mixture. Okay, so we know that we need to half the air that we're sending to the engine to get the fuel value. So we can delete this actual throttle lever for the fuel now. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and take the air and divide it by 2. Okay, so we're going to go and search for a divide block. Just a simple in-game divide block. I could use a function block, but this is once again a very basic tutorial at the moment. And you know what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go and add another throttle lever over here. Okay, now this will allow me to come onto this throttle lever and say this is the air/fuel ratio, for example. And I can come in and say, well, by default, we're going to start by dividing the air by 2, okay, to get our fuel ratio. But I want to maybe change it. Maybe I want to adjust it up and down so I can change my AFR, maybe tweak it a little bit. Okay, so we're going to start it at 2, and we're going to go in here. We're going to take the air throttle. We're then going to divide it by the actual ratio that we're calculating, and we're going to send that in for our fuel ratio. Make sure, of course, you have electricity, and I also like to change the sensitivity on my throttle levers so it's not so violent when we're changing gears here. Go and spawn this in now, and you'll notice that once again, as we give it, let's say 1 point, let's do 0.2, okay, it's dividing it by the 2, which means that now it's going and giving it a 0.1 in theory. Let's go and check page up. There we go. Can you see for the actual, for the AB there, it's giving a 0.09, which is a 0.1 in theory, okay, for our fuel. So we can go and start the engine up. Okay, perfect. Now we don't need to touch this, and we can just adjust our air ratio, and it's adjusting our fuel as we move on here, which is really pretty cool. So now you have one throttle lever to control your engine. Okay, so very simple so far here. But you'll notice if we hover over here, our air fuel ratio is currently 13.7, which is not ideal. We want to get it to 14.7 to be more or less 100% efficient and to get everything nice and working. Well, how do we do that? Well, this is where we can come in and adjust our fuel air ratio mixture. So we can go in here and say, hey, give it a little more fuel, please. Okay, what's happening? Okay, 14.8. Okay, well, let's get it down a little bit. Let's go and bring it down to, there we go, 14.7. Let's increase our throttle a little bit. Let's see, there we go. So now it's a little bit, let's see, efficiency is going down a little bit too much there. So we can play around with this air fuel ratio until we get to exactly where we want. Let's go and drop it down a bit, 14.4. That almost looks perfect, okay, for this specific engine. Okay, which is really quite nice. We can drop this down. Let's do like 0.06. Okay, and yeah, you can play around with this to get whatever values you want. This engine's now gone and died a little bit, so let's go and turn it on again. There we go, and now it's just gonna go and idle around that value. So let's go up a little bit more. There we go. Okay, so you can play around this. As I said earlier, I've got a full actual controller that does this for you, depending on the engine, depending on the setup. But now let's have a look at a few other things. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and give it double the amount of air that we should have on this engine. Okay, so I'm going to go here, I'm going to add another intake for my air, and I'm going to add another air filter. Yeah, so I've doubled up on my air now. So we're going to have a new ratio for our actual fuel here, because we're giving double air, so we need more fuel. Okay, so it actually might be smart to come in here and say the max value is 4, for example. Okay, so let's go in here. Perfect, everything is still connected, everything is connected there. Great, we can now spawn this in. Now in theory, this is going to have way too much air in it, because we're only going to go and take the air mixture here. So let's say 0.1, we're dividing it by half, which means it's not getting enough fuel in this engine. We'll see that now as soon as we click on the push button. Have a look at our ratios here. We've got way too much air in this engine. So this is where you can now go and adjust this. Let's say 4 here, for example. We've adjusted that now. Let's go and increase it. Okay, and you can see the air fuel ratio is too high. So let's go and bring it down. Let's see if we can get that air fuel ratio. Look at that. So we're doing, yep, about 1, which is almost perfect. So there we go. Let's go and start it up now. And there you go. Okay, so this is the joy of having this availability here to go and adjust things. Now we can of course decrease our throttle and get this engine running a little bit lower. Now you can see at a low throttle like that, the engine's running much better in comparison to what it was running earlier, because we've doubled up the fuel and then we've also gone and given it more air. So that's a very, very basic way of how you can set up and build a modular engine in Stormworks. You can build it as big as you want to, you can build it as small as you want to, you can leave the drive belt off, you can add the drive belt, you can use electric pumps, you can use these modular engine drive belt pumps, you can use a lot of air, you can use air scoops. And actually let's go and demonstrate that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this off and let's go and connect a pump on there. So we could use one of the modular engine pumps, we could use all different types of pumps that we want. Once again, just like I showed you guys earlier on. So we have an in, so let's say fluid port, it's going to get fresh air into the modular pump. It's then going to come out and it's going to go into our actual engine just over here. Okay, so it's going to go in there. So now it's going in, putting a lot of air into this engine. So let's see how much of a different ratio we're going to need for this, because we've gone added a pump now for the intake of the air. So let's go and put our throttle to like 0.1, increase it up here. That looks fine at the moment. Okay, let's go and increase our throttle. And you can see as we're increasing our throttle, which means more power is going into that pump, our actual air fuel ratio is actually getting offset. Okay, which means we will need to go and adjust this. So let's go down a little bit. There we go. Down a little more. You can hear the engine revving up. There we go. So you can play completely around with this. This is now getting a little bit too much air. Okay, you can see way too much air. Let's go and bring it down. So you can play around with these fuel ratios. As I said, as you build your engine, doesn't matter how you build it, you will need to obviously change that ratio part. If you give it more air, obviously you need to bring that ratio down. If you give it less air, you need to bring that ratio up. Okay, and vice versa. So guys, this is a nice quick little tutorial to build you. I'd love to see what you guys can come up with this. Leave a comment below if you have enjoyed this video and found it somewhat entertaining and also informative. I know a lot of people have been struggling with these modular engines at the moment, getting it built up and wanted a full tutorial. So here is a full tutorial. Definitely keep an eye out for another one. We're going to be doing a tutorial on cooling, because I know a lot of people are having issues with cooling at the moment, and that's a big topic at the moment. So we'll take another tutorial looking at that. And yeah, definitely keep an eye out for a lot of people using these over on the workshop. And as always, I hope you have enjoyed this and found it entertaining and informative as always. And until the next one, we'll see you then.